Morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of the Biodiversity podcast by Teasels. And in episode 1, I am talking to Gary Grant of the Green Infrastructure Consultancy. How are you, Gary?
Very well, thank you.
Good stuff, good stuff. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Gary, do you want to give us, before we get started, do you want to give us a bit of blurb, a bit of a background on yourself? And so you're obviously working with the Green Infrastructure Consultancy at the moment, but do you want to give us a bit of war and peace about your sort of work history and, just give a bit of background to the viewers out there?
Yeah, so I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So I work as a professional ecologist. I'm a chartered environmentalist. As you say, I'm with the Green Infrastructure Consultancy, and I began my career as a field officer for the London Wildlife Trust. So I was always interested in urban nature conservation or urban ecology. And over the years, because of one thing and another with grants and so on, I moved from the NGO side of things to consultancy. So I've been working as a consultant now for a long time, and most of my work is in the urban environment, although not all of it. And we're very fortunate in the Green Infrastructure Consultancy because we work at all scales, from strategic planning. So I recently worked on the South Essex Green Infrastructure Strategy as a sub-consultant to others, urban and they're called, and Prior and Partners. So I'm there to just fill in the gaps, if you like. And so that was a very large piece of work covering a very large area. So it's about the landscape and networks and so on, right down to the design of a bee hotel or a single green roof or a green wall. So it's a really privileged position to be in, where you're working at all scales. And it's very helpful for people who only work at one or other end of the scale, because it helps them to understand how all this fits together. Not that anyone really understands it, it's so complicated, but it's a nice thing to be able to do, to try and think through how policy ends up affecting individual projects.
Yeah. So it's interesting, you mentioned about, you've always been sort of focused on sort of urban ecology. Was that a conscious decision, or were you ever did wildlife parks and dealing with ecology, perhaps in the agricultural, in the wider countryside? Did that ever appeal to you, or?
Well, I moved to London after university. I'm from Poole in Dorset. So I moved to London, and then I was drawn into the London Wildlife Trust and their work. So that was interesting in itself. And of course, back in those days, a lot of people in nature conservation didn't really feel that nature belonged in cities. It was a countryside thing. And there's still an element of that, as you know. But I was brought up on the edge of a town, Poole in Dorset, and in those days Poole was expanding rapidly, and my playground had sand lizards running around in it, on the edge of a clay pit. And I went, as a boy, I would go to the wardens on Brownsea Island and say, do you know that actually I've got more sand lizards on my clay pit than you have in your nature reserve? And they say, oh, no, you don't know what you're looking at. And I actually brought one of those wardens to the edge of Poole, and he had a look, but they weren't really that impressed. So sort of post-industrial, urban fringe, all that sort of thing was of great interest to me, even as a child, because I could see that you could have very rich biodiverse habitats in places that the grown-ups, if you like, would just write off as being a wasteland or something that's not pristine or you can't do anything with.
Would you categorize that into, is it novel ecosystems? Is that the terminology we use these days?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, they're degraded ecosystems, but they often include a lot of the natural features, don't they? So it's not like anything in ecology, it's not that straightforward. I mean, you can try and categorize these things, but of course, that's part of the problem, that urban habitats don't fit the conventional categories. That, you know, the people that wrote the manuals, if you like, describing the classic types of habitat were more natural environments, although in the UK they're not entirely natural, as we know, but people used to think of them as more natural. And so when you get to the very messed up, if you like, and muddled up urban areas, people can't classify it. And it's still causing a problem right now. So, you know, we've got things like the DEFRA biodiversity net gain agenda, and the urban, the application of their net gain biodiversity metric doesn't really work in urban areas.
So can we dive into that a bit? So when we've talked in the past about the biodiversity net gain,
yeah.
What is your, so you're saying there's a bit of trouble implementing that, and some we've talked in the past about some councils, planning authorities want to take that forward, some don't. Could you expand on that? Is that okay?
Yeah. Well, I think it's in the policy now. It's in the policy, so that's good. But of course, defining net gain, it can become tricky. As I say, the methodologies that are used are improving. You know, it's a work in progress, and people who work in urban areas are commenting on this and helping to refine it. But I think anything that's developed in a countryside with a environment of fields and hedges, when you take that mindset and any methodology developed in that situation and try and apply it in the jumbled up environment of the urban landscape, it doesn't quite work. And so the polygons that are drawn, which is what it boils down to, isn't it, nowadays? You draw a line around an area and then you measure and classify that area.
Yeah. In
the urban area, those polygons get very, very small and jumbled up, and it gets tricky. So it's technically it's a difficult thing. But of course, on the positive side, in most urban areas, you're starting with a low bar, aren't you? So it may well be that there isn't very much, so you can get net gain. Where it gets really tricky is with these brownfield sites where, you know, the developers or the planners or the architects might assume that there's nothing there.
Yeah. And
then we know as ecologists there's often a lot there, and so then you can't really get net gain on site by redeveloping a lot of these very species rich brownfield sites. So it can be tricky, especially on the urban fringe.
So but correct me if I'm wrong, with the biodiversity net gain, it's if they can't have a net gain on site, then they can sort of get it, basically put some money towards having biodiversity net gain off-site. Is that?
Yeah, but that really is that's the end of the chain of decision making.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're trying to avoid damage to start with.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like the EIA mitigation hierarchy. You want to avoid before you get to mitigate, before you get to compensate. So writing a check to someone who's got a nature reserve some distance away is the last resort, if you like.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be, well, we can do that, so let's just do that. You've got to do something for the local area. You've got to preserve, you've got to restore where people are, where that development is and where people are, because they need it. I need green infrastructure in my town. It's no good if it's 20 miles away or 30 miles away. It might be good for that site, but so there's that. You need to remember that there's a hierarchy of decision making, and of course not everyone's aware of that.
Yeah.
Or if they know that they've got the option of writing the check, then sometimes that's the first thought that they've got. That just leave us alone, we'll do business as usual, and then we'll write the check, and that's it.
Excellent. So okay, so going back a couple of steps, you were mentioning that you were writing the remind me the environmental action plan for South Essex,
Green infrastructure strategy for South Essex. Yeah.
So then, but you mentioned, so you work on that larger scale, but also you work on a smaller scale by implementing singular green roofs, linking to subsystems. Do you want to give us some examples of both and where you've applied those?
Yeah, so on a strategic level, we recently wrote a green infrastructure strategy for the city of Swansea in Wales. So the client was Natural Resources Wales, and we're working with the council as well, because they're in effect they're the ones that will implement that strategy. So that's looking at the whole urban area, mapping it, that's always available, done by others, and then looking at corridors, but then also looking at ways in which the planning system can be changed to make better outcomes more likely. So rather than saying exactly what's going to happen everywhere, which you can't really do, it's all about, well, in these areas we expect this to happen, or there might be an issue with flood or a lack of access to biodiversity. So that's all on the map, but the detail is for the people that own those sites and develop and maintain those sites. It's up to them. It's a free world, as they say. So it's about how the council molds the city and encourages and protects and so on. So it's a very tricky thing. And of course, we know that there are hundreds of reports that are written in the past that no one ever read. Every town's got strategies, policies, initiatives, which are commissioned. They look great. Often the senior management don't even look at it because it's commissioned by the head of this or the head of that. The politicians don't read it. It goes on the shelf, and then people just do what they do, or what they're allowed to do. So there's a very strong emphasis on the legislation and so on. Understandably, people want to bring more rules in. So that was the situation there. So one of the things we've introduced to Swansea was the green space factor.
Okay.
So it's already in London. We work with the Mayor of London on this, where it's called the urban greening factor. But they call it the green space factor in Swansea. And this is something that started in Germany years ago, which is a way of measuring the quantity and the quality of green space in new developments.
Okay.
So, that's an example of a macro approach, which hopefully will have micro consequences.
Interesting. So I assume what we'll do at the end of the podcast, I'll put a link so we can put a link at the bottom of this, so then people can click onto it. So yeah. Okay, so that was sorry, going back a couple of steps, that was initiative that was started in Germany.
Yes, so the urban greening factor in Germany is called the Biotope area factor. And the idea is to try and increase the amount of permeable surfaces in urban landscapes. And so the idea is that every type of feature, from a tree to a driveway to a lawn to a shrubbery, has a score between 0 and 1. So 0 is concrete or asphalt, and 1 is a forest, a natural forest. So everything has a score between 0 and 1. So you measure all the areas, you give it a score, you multiply the area by the score, add it all together and divide it by the site area, and then you get an overall score between 0 and 1. So a site that's 100% concrete would be 0, and a site that's 100% forest would be 1. And the target, sorry, just to finish that, and then the council would set a target of typically 0.3 or 0.4. And you know, in the on the continent, it might be a requirement, but in the UK, it's advisory or an expectation or an aspiration. But it's a real it's transformative, because it means the planners can say to the applicant, "We're looking at 0.3, 0.4 here, target, and you're nowhere near it." Or, "Well done, you know, this is an excellent scheme, and it's right up there with it's at the target or surpassed it." So it makes the conversation a lot easier between the planners and the landowners, developers.
So that's it. So it's specifically linked to sort of SUDs and how you deal with water.
Yeah, that's the origins of it. That's the science behind it. But it's really quite a good proxy for other things. So the higher the score, the more likely it is to be better for biodiversity, for amenity, and so on. It's not a replacement for biodiversity measurements. You still probably need to do that, but it's a pretty good general proxy for multifunctional landscapes, because of the way the scores are made.
Interesting. So you got that on a sort of a larger landscape scale.
Yeah.
And then I know you do a lot of work with green roofs. So I guess green roofs ticks loads of boxes, but they tick in terms of the flora, but also in terms of green roofs sitting within hopefully an integrated system.
Yeah. Well, there's a great link there between green roofs and what we were just talking about, because if you have, say you have an urban development and there's no ground level landscape to speak of, just as you'd have in a city centre, in the City of London. So you have a building on a plot, and then you might have a little bit of pavement, and getting a score of 0.4 on a plot, on a totally urban plot, you would think, well, that's almost impossible in a conventional way. Meeting SUDS objectives on a plot like that is almost impossible, except maybe with SUDS you could have a giant tank in the basement to collect all the water, but that isn't multifunctional SUDS, because you know the SUDS Venn diagram has amenity, biodiversity, doesn't it? It's not just about the volume and water quality. It's not just the volume of water. So a giant tank isn't going to really do it anyway, but some people might argue that. So this is where green roofs come in, because if I can put a green roof on the top of that building, then I can meet targets, I can slow the flow, I can create habitat. It can be really good habitat as well, because it might be an area where you can have wildflowers and so on. So
Gary, for the uninitiated, I've had many conversations in the past with people about green roofs, and then they say, what, the sedum stuff? So can you? We both know that green roofs can be a lot more than that. So do you want to sort of give people an understanding what, you know, perhaps the evolution of green roofs? Where we've come from, and where we're at now.
Yeah. So it's probably worth going back even one step earlier that, and saying that you've got, with green roofs, you're talking about where you deliberately vegetate the roof.
Yes.
That could be a garden.
Yeah.
A roof garden. So we call that an intensive green roof. And then it could be a relatively lightweight, extensive green roof, which isn't really a garden. It's a covering which is vegetated, which is low maintenance, fit and forget, if you like, although that's not what you should do. You should maintain it, but it's something which is nice and simple. And because sedums grow really well on a non-irrigated roof, sedums have become the plant that people know works well. They've learned how to grow sedum in pre-vegetated mats, which they can unroll on a roof. And so the extensive green roof industry, which more or less started in Germany, has been dominated by sedum And now, as you imply, a lot of people think, yeah, that's a sedum roof.
Mm.
A green roof is a sedum roof. You know, you often see emails from local authorities and they say, we want a sedum roof, you know, thinking that's the only type of green roof. So there's that. And, you know, a sedum roof can be it can be suitable, it can be a good thing. But the lesson from our colleagues in Switzerland mainly, which was picked up by Dusty Gedge and spread around as an idea, is this idea of the biodiverse roof, which means you can take a lot of drought tolerant plants. Usually they're the sort of wildflowers you'd see, you know, on chalk or a stressed environment or on a brownfield site, and you can grow them on a roof in a free draining growing medium, which the green roof industry can provide you with, lightweight, free draining, water absorbent. So you've got that option of, in effect, a dry grassland roof or wildflowers, drought tolerant wildflower roof, which is also low maintenance but is very biodiverse.
Yes.
And that's the one that I try to push. You know, sometimes sedum is appropriate, but probably a mix of sedums growing with wildflowers is something in our environment in the UK is probably more often than not what you should be aiming for that kind of extensive green roof.
Yeah, and there's the sort of hybrid of that is the blue green roof, where it's sort of do you want to explain a bit about that? Because correct me if I'm wrong, didn't we see when you did a tour around some of the green roofs on the Olympic site a couple of years ago, and we saw how that integrates into again into the sort of the downpipe and into the sud system that way.
So a green roof is a vegetated roof. A blue roof is a roof that's designed to hold rainwater on the building for a period, so that the water doesn't go straight into the drains and then overwhelm the drains, you know, if there's a storm. So a blue roof is a bit like it could be an open tank on a roof.
Yeah.
But as you say, you can have blue-green roofs where the two come together. So you've got a vegetated roof, but the water might be held in a void under the roof. So it goes through the roof into a void which is there, and then there's a dam or a throttled outlet, so the water doesn't rush straight into the downpipes. And then, of course, that water, if it's under the green roof, then may be whipped up into the green roof and then evaporated. So you're holding that much more of that water on the roof than you would with a green roof alone. So the green roof alone might only hold half of the rain on it, say, depending on the type of roof and what's going on with the climate. But a blue-green roof could hold virtually all of that rain if you wanted it to.
Yeah. And
of course, most of the blue-green roofs have got the water under the green roof, but why not have a wetland roof where the water's temporarily held on top of the green roof? So you can imagine a green roof which floods deliberately, the water's held up there in a sort of temporary pond, if you like, and then it evaporates or trickles through an outlet. So that's a really exciting one here. Worries people a bit, of course, because it's so unusual, but it's something that has been done, and that could be a very special habitat on a building in the form of a blue-green roof.
Because if I put my sort of head into sort of architects, developers listening to this podcast, they may be thinking, what are you actually saying? You're actually saying hold water on a roof? I can't get my head around that. And so, but correct me if I'm wrong. To the infrastructure or the sort of the roof support or the sort of infrastructure, the roof infrastructure. It doesn't have to be massively. It doesn't have to be a massive upgrade, does it? It doesn't. Because I remember talking to John Little about this recently, and you know, the actual work you've got to put in to provide enough support to support everything, you know, all the green, the blue green roof, isn't a massive extra expense. Have I got that correct?
Well, it's in terms of the overall building, you know, the cost of the overall building. It's not a massive extra expense.
Yeah.
It's just a, you know, bigger joists, or, you know, obviously the building has to be a little bit stronger, because water is, you know, water does weigh one cubic meter of water weighs a ton, doesn't it? So, you know, 10 centimeters of water weighs 100 kilograms. So, you know, it's an extra weight, but it's not a super huge deal, because, you know, we can design roofs to take people, you know, we can, who can be quite heavy, especially groups of them. There are roofs that are designed to take, you know, equipment and so on. So it's not really a big problem, as long as the engineer who's designing the building or the roof knows about it. Then they can make an allowance for that. The problem comes when a building already exists and you can't take the extra weight, probably in many cases, not all. It depends on the structure. You know, if it's a reinforced concrete building with a concrete slab, maybe it can. But if the building hasn't been designed to take that weight, it's a problem. And often, even within the planning process, if someone says we want a heavy green roof or a blue-green roof quite a long way down the design track, and the engineer didn't know that was on the agenda, that can become a real problem, because you'll often hear people say, well, we've already designed the structure of this building, and we really are going to struggle here to find that extra strength, you know, because they would have to redesign, in extreme cases, even the foundations, you know. So people often think about the roof, but often it's the whole building that needs to have the strength for that weight, you know. Even lightweight wooden buildings with green roofs can sink a little bit. You know, some of the sort of wooden buildings that John designs, they need good foundations for the extra weight.
Yeah. So one thing that springs to mind with what you were just saying is, so as part of your role is to get involved with the planning of buildings at an early stage. So rather than you come in a week before it goes to planning, are you working with developers, so you are there week one, day one, so you can say, this is what we can do with the roof, and therefore this is what you need?
Well, sometimes we are. As you say, ideally we would be, and sometimes we are, to be fair. But unfortunately, you know, there are situations where the planning authority might have raised an issue quite close to the point where someone's ready to submit plans, and it can become a real challenge to incorporate features, because of, you know, the difficulty of finding the space, or the strength in the structure, or overcoming other issues like you know, air conditioning plant drains, or whatever the thing that's fixed, if you like. So it's not always, you know, sometimes people think it's bad, it's ill will that people don't want to do it. Of course, there are people that don't want to do this stuff, but often it's just a situation where if you like, we've painted ourselves into a corner and there's not a lot we can do, unfortunately. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The earlier people can get involved in this, the better, because then you've got more options, haven't you?
Very much so. So I'm kind of thinking, you know, like, if sort of tips to any architect developers listening is, you know, just to, you know, don't just think of architectural technologists, perhaps bring you guys, you know, or, you know, ecological consultants in from, you know, sort of an early stage, so at least you can be planning ahead, and it's not some sort of knee-jerk reaction, you know.
And it's the same for the landscape architects and others who, you know, should be seen as part of the design team, so that we can really think around green infrastructure and other issues like renewable energies and so on, so that it's not a bolt-on.
Yeah.
Sometimes it could be a bolt-on, but it's not always a bolt-on, and usually it's better not to have a bolt-on, but it's better to think it through, get everything in the right place, get the synergies that you can get from combining different technologies and so on. Yeah.
Because what I found really interesting was I forget the name of the building, but we saw the green roof, but it was a green roof, but had solar panels on top.
Yep.
And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but the transpiration from the leaves was cooling the solar panels and making them operate at a sort of an optimum. Is it 25 degrees? Is that correct?
Yeah. So that is a classic example of where some people might think there's a conflict and say, you know, we like PVs, photovoltaics, because we want the renewable energy, and we like green roofs because we like biodiversity and we like drainage, but you can't have both. So you know, I've been in many meetings where that's been the suggestion. You've got to make a choice. But in fact, you don't. You can have both. So we call them biosolar roofs, where you have PVs combined with extensive green roofs. There's lots of cool things about it. It is literally cooler, as you say, because of the evaporative cooling. The substrate from the green roof can weigh down the frames. You get different plants growing under the shade as opposed to those in the gaps. So you get more diversity. No doubt the odd bird shelters under there from the storm and so on. So of course, it's not a garden, it's a functioning roof, but it's providing you with a lot of services, if you like.
Yeah.
And that's something which is actually now becoming known. It's not, you know, 5 years ago, it was still something exotic from Switzerland or southern Germany. Now, to be fair, most architects will have heard of that now, or they should have done. So we're in a period now where people have heard of it, but they may not be able to implement it all that well. Because when you get to the construction stage, you might be engaging with people who haven't come across this before. Yeah. So that's so we're at a stage now where things like this are becoming more common as a concept, but the implementation of it is often not quite right because they've chosen the wrong equipment, or the green roof build up isn't quite right, or somebody had size 14 boots and wrecked something when they were installing it, or, you know, those sorts of problems of coordination, the order that you build it, and the maintenance as well. So we're, you know, the industry as a whole isn't quite up to speed yet, but it's getting there because this is becoming more and more common. And of course, there'll be more products on the market which help people to overcome those technical difficulties, because there'll be more and more people who say, well, actually, we've already done this, we know how to do it. If you combine our equipment with this type of green roof, it will work, and so on. So it's going to get easier, but there's a few cock-ups out there, yeah.
And as you're talking, I'm thinking about perhaps the evolution of the green wall industry, and you know, talk about, you know, many moons ago there was quite a few cumbersome systems out there, but they've evolved, and I want to say it's been the green wall industry has been democratized, where there is a lot of systems out there, and you know, I would guess in the early days, like you say, there was quite a few cock-ups, but the systems out there now are they're easier to maintain when they go wrong. Let's just say that. Well,
yeah. I think that's a fair summary. I mean, I was quite fortunate because I was working with AECOM, which is a big engineering consultancy, back in 2008. And it was suggested that there be a green wall on the Westfield shopping centre in Shepherd's Bush. And we were able to specify a Canadian green wall product for that. and that in effect introduced the intensive green walls into the UK. And that's been through a couple of modifications. You know, there were some problems, but it's still there. But of course, since 2008, we've now got 4 or 5 rival suppliers in competition. They've obviously developed more than a decade of experience now, some of them, so that the type of plants that they use, they know what works and what doesn't. They're finding new plants that work all the time, which is another great a great thing, because in the very beginning people were nervous about failure, understandably, but now there's a lot more you can do. There's a lot more knowledge about, you know, north facing versus south facing. The irrigation systems are really sophisticated now, so you get a text message on your mobile phone that tells you the volume of water that's gone through every day. And, you know, you can even adjust the irrigation from your phone now. So, you know, the days of, you know, the classic was the one back in the day where somebody switched off the irrigation and didn't realize, you know, turn the wrong tap, that kind of thing, and the whole thing dies. In theory now, as long as there's a maintenance contract or someone getting that message on their phone, they would know within 24 hours that there's a problem.
Yeah. And
so they could step in within a week to get it fixed, and you would never even know that there was a problem. But of course, you do need an intelligent person to receive that text, and you do need a maintenance contract in place so that someone can actually do something. So, you know, they are vulnerable, those intensive green walls, because without maintenance, they will fail. Whereas, of course, the traditional thing of growing climbers up a wall or a trellis, you know, will probably work even if you neglect it for a year or so.
So on to that point, so I've seen recently that sort of these quite growing climbers up buildings, not on a sort of an industrial sort of metal trellis.
Yeah.
That's I don't know if that's got now it's got a fancy name or what we call that, but I've seen a lot more of that over sort of commercial large industrial buildings. Is that becoming more of a thing, perhaps working in coordination with green walls?
Well, yeah, I suppose you would call that a kind of green wall. So what you're seeing is, so the old-fashioned, you know, the wisteria cottage a wisteria is in the ground and it climbs up around the porch, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you might tie it off. So that's that. And of course you might even have ivies just growing up a wall, and you know, that's good for wildlife and so on. So what you're describing is where you know you're creating a wire mesh, say, which can be a good thing because you've still got that air gap and you can maintain the building. And also it's often it fits with an industrial or commercial building. But of course you can grow those plants in a trough. You could grow it in the ground, but then you can grow it in a trough, and that trough can be at various heights. So in effect you can create a relatively low-tech green wall using planters and mesh, and or steel wires with rampant climbers like Boston ivy. So there's lots of possibilities there. You could even mix and match different things. And probably one of the things you've seen a lot of are what they call these green fences. So it's a bit like a wire fence with ivy growing on it, and a planter at the bottom of it, which has been previously grown, all ready to go. You pop it on the truck, and it's an instant green screen. So, you know, that is very popular because it's instant, and it's cheaper than a fancy high-tech, you know, modular green wall with 96 plants per square meter or whatever. You know, this is just an ivy screen. It looks great, but of course it still needs irrigation until it gets going if it's in the ground. If it's perched up, you know, on the side of a multi-story car park, it will also need a bit of irrigation.
Mm. Yeah, no,
It could go wrong.
Yeah, no, I've seen it. I mean, it's been used in a prominent development in Cambridge, and I thought it worked successfully. You know, had to sort of screen the edge of the development.
Yeah.
I thought it worked very well, but like you say,
but you know, if you're patient, you can put things in the ground and they will grow up several stories. But you know, most building owners or planners will, if you say you have to wait 10 years, they'll say, well, we'll probably knock the building down by then, so we're not going to wait that long. So, you know, but if you're patient, you can grow climbers, can't you, up trellises and really get something that's very effective and cheap.
Yeah, very much so. And again, there's sort of you know, there's such a variety out there now. It isn't just wisteria, Boston ivy. You know, you've got a lot of good climbers, you know, coming over from sort of China. I'm thinking of Hobelia. A lot of what you would say climate change ready plants as well.
I think that there's no reason why, as long as they're not invasive species, why you can't use a variety of climbers. And you know, climbers are a natural part of the forest ecosystem, aren't they? Lianas, you know, and so we really ought to think more about climbers in all sorts of situations. You know, you can imagine a pavement. You can have a pergola with climbers over it, shading people from the sun, and without really interfering with the people moving around. There's a lot that we could do with climbers, a lot more. And I think with overheating in summer, you could imagine climbers covering whole streets. You know, you see that in Spain, don't you? If you go to the south of Spain, you often see climbers on wires, 10 meters up above the street and the road, in places like Granada, shading the whole thing.
So that kind of leads me kind of seamlessly on to sort of, you know, how green infrastructure is going to help with, climate change, urban heating, island effect. Do you want to go into a bit of that? Because I do think the amount of people I speak to sort of just don't want to think about climate change and the effects it's going to have. But I feel that it's something we need to touch on about, you know, again, how green infrastructure in places like London, in cities, can have a quantifiable effect and benefit, you know, as we head further into climate change.
Yeah, well, I find the sponge city idea very helpful. It's being promoted in China. Someone in India says they invented it, not the Chinese, but it doesn't matter who invented it. It's a good idea, you know, the sponge city. And the sponge city means that instead of the water being sent straight to the drains where it is gone, and where it's causing flooding downstream and where it's washing pollutants away, we hold that water in our sponge city. Now that's really good in terms of reducing flooding. And you know, we've already talked about that a bit, haven't we, with blue roofs and so on. That's all part of the sponge city. But if all of our tree pits and our planters and our, you know, wherever we can, we're intercepting the water and holding it. You can even modify a green wall so there are tanks behind it to hold water. We've had the blue roof. We can have downpipe planters where water comes out of a downpipe into a planter, which can be an effective tank with planting and wicking. Then we can go into the rain gardens, and then there might be swales and so on. So our sponge city can help deal with that flash flooding, which is predicted to become worse with climate change. But then the really clever bit is all that water then evaporates during the warm weather to cool us down. So the sponge city is really the answer to climate change adaptation.
Yeah, interesting, because I think we've seen a sort of microcosm of that on the Olympic Park and how successful that's been. Is that be fair to say?
Yeah, well, the Olympic Park was a great way of trying out a few things which were relatively new at that time. So, you know, the Olympic Park was planned from about 2006. I was working with EDOR, which became AECOM, which was the planner for the park. And, you know, it wasn't easy to get some of those things into the scheme because all this was very new then. But fortunately, there are features in the Olympic Park, like swales and so on. But of course, it's relatively easy to do something like that in a giant park. So though that's a great thing, the challenge now is not just parks, which need to be upgraded, if you like, to be a better part of the Sponge City. It's the buildings and the streets. So we've already talked about the buildings, but the streets is another one where, you know, traditionally it's all hard, the water goes into the drains and that's the end of it. But as we know, the streets can be, you know, much cleverer. You know, we can have more trees, tree pits to absorb runoff, maybe pergolas, shade structures. If you've got buildings nearby, it might be that the buildings are part of that approach. Green walls could be really important in green streets as well, keeping down the air pollution. So yeah, I can't even remember your question now, but
no, it's all good. We're talking. You were
about, yeah, suds and whatnot. Yeah.
So you were in the moment there. I didn't want to stop you. So
sorry about that. Yeah, I was going off on one there. Yeah.
But again, what springs to mind is, so again, if you know, if I'm looking at this podcast and I'm thinking, yeah, that's lovely, and you know, I'm a planner and I'm an architect, and yeah, we've got this new town over here in Cambridge, and we can do that because it's just a field, and we can implement everything you're talking about. But how does it work? How does that work retrofitting? You know, take for example, you've got you know, Cambridge is my sort of native city. It's a blooming medieval town. How could we even begin to sort of think about retrofitting that in?
Yeah, well, that really is more important in a way, isn't it? Because I can't remember the exact figure, but people often say that the city of the future is already there. Because, you know, all right, we've got new towns, we've got new cities and countries, developing countries, of course, new build is big. But in a mature, historic city, it's already there. You know, 10% of it will be renewed, but the rest of it is that, you know, it's, as you say, it's about retrofit. And if it's a historic building, then if you can't really change the appearance of it. But even with historic buildings, you know, often there are green roofs retrofitted because sometimes there are parts of that building which, you know, are not visible.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, which years ago had a green roof put on it, and it's a listed building, and the heritage people we thought might be concerned, but they said, no, it's fine. At the moment, it's just a flat roof, which you can't see. So if you need to green it, that's fine. So even with historic buildings, listed buildings, as they call them, there may be things that can be done. And then, of course, you've got the downpipes, which could be leading to rain gardens. So at the moment, there might be a garden that could be modified into a rain garden, which still is a garden. To the layman, it's still a garden, but it's been modified so that it takes more water during storms. So there's, even with the most, you know, precious historic buildings and settings, there's often more that you could do than you might imagine. And of course, things like climbers, which we were talking about just now, often are part of the historic landscape. You know, you see an old photograph of the average listed building, it probably had climbers on it anyway at one point or another.
That's true. I can just see the wisteria growing up it now, really, can't you?
Yeah. And so, you know, there's also on that, there's a conventional view that plants damage buildings, but a lot of research has shown that actually they protect buildings, you know, as long as you're doing the right thing. And, because you're protecting it from the ultraviolet light and the frost and so on. So there's quite a lot we can do even in the most sensitive areas. And then when you've got you know, the 1960s Woolworths being redeveloped in Swansea High Street, there's all these reinforced concrete buildings which were put up after the war because it was bombed. Then the 60s, it was reinforced concrete, and some of those buildings, they are solid. So what the architects are saying is there's nothing wrong with the frame of this building. It's reinforced concrete. It was Woolworths. It was derelict for a while. Now it's going to become housing, and those flats are going to have roof gardens, biosolar roofs, downpipe disconnection, rain gardens in the street. So, you know, the retrofit, I mean, that's not quite retrofit, that's refurbishment, but, you know, it still shows you what's possible with existing buildings.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Cool. So, Gary, I think, again, I say this in every podcast, but I could talk to you for the next 3 hours, and I'm sure that would be fun for you as well, but we've all got to get on, haven't we? So
Yeah. Anyway, there's plenty to think about there, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good stuff. Gary, do you want to just give us a little bit of blurb at the end? So can you just tell us where people can find you, like LinkedIn, websites?
Yep.
You know, give us this sort of roll call of where we can get you.
Yeah, so if people want to know more, if they want to contact me, they can go to the Green Infrastructure Consultancy website, greeninfrastructureconsultancy.com. Bit of a mouthful, but you'll find me there. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, Gary Grant. And I know that we're going to put the links up for the Urban Greening Factor, Green Space Factor, if people want to know more about that. And also livingroofs.org, which is a great source for anything to do with green roofs and green walls. So plenty there to get your teeth into.
Fantastic. Gary, you're a legend, mate. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. See ya.
Yeah, bye-bye.